Good evening, everybody. Very welcome to Novice Night. I think I got the wrong end of the stick. I'm rather disappointed not to see you all in habits and wimples. I'm delighted to be here to direct what must be one of the greatest operas ever written. It appears regularly in the top 10 of all operas performed in the world, and has done for many, many years. And it's one of those pieces that appeals to everybody, from somebody straight off the street watching their first opera all the way to the aficionados, the critics, and professionals like myself, because it is so multi-layered. It has a real popular appeal, but it also has tremendous nuance. It has brilliant wit, comic invention, moments of pathos, tenderness, and then it suddenly all descends into farce, brilliant farce. So it's a truly wonderful piece. I hope this evening that we'll do it justice. We certainly have a fabulous young cast, very fresh, very fine singers and actors. So if you don't like it, it'll be my fault. Just to tell you a little bit about where this piece started, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Beaumarchais, the French playwright who wrote the original play, The Marriage of Figaro, on which the opera is based. Well, he was an extraordinary character. He started off as a clockmaker's son, and he was apprenticed as a clockmaker, but he was obviously very clever. Throughout his life, he did all sorts of extraordinary things. First of all, he invented, as a clockmaker, he invented something that would make a watch much more accurate, and had that invention stolen by a noble, who was actually the clockmaker to the king, and passed it off as his own invention. And Beaumarchais said to his dad, this is unfair, and he said, son, that's life. You know, the nobles will always squash you down. And I think that's where, Figaro begins, really, for him. But after that, he also became the clockmaker to the court of Louis XV. He was a musician. He taught harp to the daughters of Louis XV. He also raised money to help the Americans fight the War of Independence. He ran multiple businesses. He got into all sorts of legal squabbles. He married 3 times, and his first 2 wives were very rich. He married them, and 2 years later they both died in mysterious circumstances. So people reckoned he may have poisoned them. So a truly colourful character. And he wrote this opera, and then he turned, of course, final thing, which he's most remembered for, funnily enough, is writing plays. And he wrote a series of successful plays, and he wrote this trio, The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, and The Guilty Mother, which he were hugely successful and are studied to this day by most French school children. They are classic works. When he first wanted to put this on, Louis XVI was scandalized by the content, the satire of the aristocracy and so on. And we're talking about 1780s, near to the time of the French Revolution, so a very sensitive time. I think it was 1781, more or less. And Louis XVI wasn't having anything of it. Now, eventually he relented, but the reason he wasn't was because it was full of pretty racy satire and a definite, outspoken criticism of the feudal system in France, which was still operating at that time. In fact, there's a very famous speech towards the end of the play where Figaro really rails against the aristocracy and against inherited nobility. And that was pretty strong stuff. Well, in the end, he was persuaded to let it go on, and it was a big success and enjoyed by aristocrats, including Marie Antoinette, apparently really rather loved it. And then, but then it passed, Mozart actually heard about this opera. The play itself arrived in Vienna when Mozart was in Vienna. And the play itself was yet again, in fact, banned by Emperor Joseph II because of, very similar reasons. Its racy content and the criticism of the aristocracy. So Mozart, rather cleverly, he fell in love with it because it was full of the sorts of things that he loves to write about, or loves to compose about. And he found this rather brilliant librettist, Da Ponte, who you may know, wrote the librettos to all the 3 great Mozart operas, Così fan tutte and Don Giovanni, as well as The Marriage of Figaro. And he found this librettist, and they got together, and within 9 weeks, they'd made this libretto. And they rather cleverly took out a lot of the highly contentious political content to make sure that it was passed by the censor. Now, mythology has it that, in fact, the censor had banned it, but they actually got ahead of the game and got him to approve the libretto before Mozart wrote the opera. So the opera was put on with success, considerable success, but it's just grown in success over the years, and now it is this extraordinary and great institution, the Marriage of Figaro. In fact, the real title is Le nozze di Figaro in Italian, which means the wedding of Figaro, which is significant because, you know, a wedding is the moment of getting married, and the marriage is, you know, actually what takes place over the years of your relationship. And in fact, if you wanted a subtitle, in fact, the actual subtitle is The Follies of a Day, or The Madnesses of a Day, which obviously reflects on the farcical elements of the piece. But if you want another subtitle, I would call it The Marriage of the Countess, because although the trigger of the whole action is Figaro's wedding to Susanna, what it's really about is the Countess's marriage to the Count. More about that anon. So, you know, Beaumarchais, both the opera and the play have these two main themes, if you like. One is the war of the classes. It's about masters trying to get one over on their servants and vice versa. And the other is about sexual infidelities and the battle of the sexes, really. And because, I think partly because Beaumarchais and Mozart removed those more political, overtly political aspects, although there's a lot of underlying politics in the piece, as I'm sure you'll see and you probably know. There's a lot of underlying politics, but actually the opera comes to deal with more the other aspect of the piece, which is the aspect of sexual conflict and infidelities, love and deception. And this is really the centre of Mozart's piece. And I suppose that's one of the reasons that we have chosen to update the opera to a different period. Now, there's always that old question, why do directors do that? Why do they insist? Well, I think many reasons. I mean, to start with, in all honesty, to do a fully, you know, you probably, I mean, I didn't explain clearly, but the opera is intended to be set, the original setting was in Spain in about, say, 1750-ish, sometime before the French Revolution. That's the important aspect of it, where you had this thing called the feudal right, the right of the lord, which was to sleep with the bride of his subjects on the eve of their wedding, which, of course, is very much the central point in the opera. But to actually produce the full lavish 18th century production on a small stage in an intimate theatre with modest resources is actually really difficult. But also for me, often we can't imagine as an audience so well the nature of these relationships when they're so far removed in a world that really, where masters and servants, where we live now, masters and servants really don't exist, except metaphorically, of course, they do, but in reality they don't. So it's nice sometimes to bring the action perhaps into a world that might have more resonance for a contemporary audience, as well as the practical aspects, really, of how can you do justice with the very elaborate costumes and the ornate settings you would kind of require to set it in its true period. So I suppose by making a virtue of necessity, one looks around. I've actually done a completely contemporary version. And what you realize is that, you know, the secretary who desperately sort of tries to keep her boss at a distance when he's pursuing her, she has to kind of flirt with him a little bit. She has to keep him, you know, keep him sweet, otherwise she risks losing everything. This is still something that happens today. And all of us, or many of us, may have experienced something similar. The pressure you get from the people in power to oblige them in all sorts of different ways. So in that sense, the theme hasn't changed at all. And what we actually chose to do in this case was, having set it contemporary and also done it at Glyndebourne in its period version, I decided, together with the designer, Nate Gibson, to find somewhere which was fresh for me as well, because I needed a kind of new challenge. And what we ended up with was 1940s in Spain. And the reason we've done that is manifold. First of all, it's the world of Franco. It's an absolutist world. It's a totalitarian world. And it's a world which resonates to me very particularly in two aspects. One is it's very militaristic and very masculine, hyper-masculine, somebody wrote, very macho kind of society. And women were, I mean, they really went back many years. They suppressed a lot of the legislation that had happened earlier in the century in Spain. And women were required once again just to fulfill their traditional roles of being the wife, the mother, the faithful wife, the person at home cooking, just kept out of the way. And that was what happened in Franco Spain. In fact, there was legislation, and women weren't allowed to be magistrates or university professors or anything. It was a very macho world, which I think makes a lot of sense with The Marriage of Figaro. And the other aspect of the piece, of this idea, in fact, those two that go together. The other aspect of Spain in this period was the artists, thinking particularly about Gaudi and Salvador Dali and the other surrealists, offered a particularly rich vein of male and female symbolism. Now, it seems to me that something that underlies the piece very strongly is the sexual symbolism. And we have in Act 1 a room which is and you can just see behind me a little hint of it. Partly, half of it is the Countess's dressing area. The other half is the Count's. It's between apartments and it's kind of sexually neutral, but it has the male aspect on the right and the female aspect on the left. And Susanna and Figaro are required to use this room once they've got married to be close, to be able to serve their master and mistress. But of course, the Count's idea is that Susanna will be very close so that he can visit her conveniently and seduce her. The second act is set in a very feminine space. It's the Countess's dressing room, and it's somewhere where really men only come if they burst in without permission or with permission. Act 3, a very masculine world. It's where all the business is done, where the Count is in charge, where all the trials happen and the wedding. So it's a public space. And finally, in Act 4, we go into the woods, where master, servant, male, female, doesn't matter who you are, you meet on equal terms. All the class and gender divides are broken down, and things become anarchical. And it seems that servants can woo mistresses and masters can woo their maids. So taking this theme into the production, we have made use quite playfully, as you will see, and you may already have noticed in some respect, a certain element of this visual, this male-female sexuality in the symbolism of the piece. But that does have, and I think the piece is a great fun piece, and I think it has a place in that humour of that, but it has a more serious message underlying it, which is that at bottom, this piece is about people who are, about the force, the primitive force of sexual desire, that underneath all the social etiquette and the manners and the classes and the differences between them, all the characters are driven, even the Countess with her infatuation with Cherubino, are driven by their sexual desire. And I suppose that's the serious aspect of this staging, which we are presenting for you tonight. I believe we've got a few minutes left. Yes, so I went rather faster than I thought. I could, of course, go on endlessly about this piece. I suppose one of the things I'd like to say a little bit more, actually, is just to point out that, I think that Mozart was famously, and if you know his music and you know his operas, incredibly empathetic with women. And the characters are, in Figaro, the female characters are the ones you really empathise with. The men really are, and in many ways the piece is an indictment of how appallingly badly the men treat their women. So, you have the obvious case of the Count who's married Rosina. It's a middle-class girl, by the way, who he's married and elevated to being a countess, and she's now stuck in her house, not really knowing what to do with herself, not used to that kind of society, and he abandons her, he gets bored with her, and he runs off after every other woman on the planet. And she, of course, becomes very, very unhappy in those circumstances. You then have the fact that Figaro, although he's a very sympathetic character, has promised at an earlier time his hand in marriage to Marcellina if she will lend him some money, and it works as a collateral. So if he can't pay it back, he has to marry Marcellina. So that's hanging over him, which was rather a mistake. that he made. And then, of course, he's incredibly jealous, and he doesn't trust Susanna. And in that sense, he is treating her rather badly and disrespectfully all the way through the piece. You have Bartolo, the lawyer, who is so angry with Figaro for stealing his bride a long time ago. This is in the previous opera, The Barber of Seville. But he uses Marcellina, poor Marcellina, as a way to get at him. And finally, we have Basilio, who, although he's a minister, even he can't resist a fondle of Susanna. And all that is actually written into the piece. I mean, there's the famous trio where he actually says, oh, look, feel how her heart is beating. Well, we all know what that means in Mozart. Whenever they say that, a character is definitely copping a fondle, if you like to say. There's a more elegant way of saying it, I'm sure. But I just thought I would add that little detail about the nature of the relationships and the characters. And I've probably now used my 5 minutes, have I? A couple more left. I've probably got time for any questions at this stage. Anybody got any questions? No? Good. Well, that's terrific. I really hope you enjoy the performance. And yes, and if anybody does have any, I'll be around. You can always ask me directly. Thank you very much.